The morning began with dry wind and white air. The snow underfoot had frozen hard overnight, a clean crust that cracked with each step. The dogs waited beside the sleds, steam rising from their breath. 3 men moved between the tents, checking ropes and gear. Each gesture was automatic. Straps pulled, knots tightened, tools checked by feel. The light was flat and colorless. The cold carried through gloves. The sled runners scraped as they turned toward the open plain. The sound vanished almost immediately. Into the wind. Behind them, 9 low camps stood under frost. Smoke drifting sideways from chimneys, they moved out before the sun touched the ridge. The river lay 8 kilometers away, invisible beyond the pale haze. The camp stretched across a shallow basin, each built from packed snow and hide walls. Between them, paths of compressed, ice-marked weeks of movement, dogs, sleds, and boots cutting the same routes each morning. Inside the main tent, firewood was stacked in a hollow metal drum. Women sorted dried meat strips and fish skins. The air smelled of smoke, fat, and iron. Nothing was wasted. Everything had a place. The fishing team carried 2 tents, 1 toolbox, 1 sled of dry wood, and a roll of wire for hanging fish. Their movements were practiced and wordless, a system refined by repetition. The lead man, carrying the ice drill, walked ahead of the sled dogs. The others followed, balancing the load as the snow hardened beneath them. The cold pressed against their eyelids. The air burned if breathed too fast. Behind them, the camp disappeared under a rising drift. Ahead, the frozen river waited, a white strip cutting through the tundra. The work had begun long before dawn, and would end only when the sled returned full. By midday, the wind had shifted. Fine snow began to move low across the ice, forming thin waves that hid the cracks beneath. They reached the river bend and stopped. The surface looked solid, but the edges held slush beneath the top layer. One man tested it with the ice drill. Water pulsed up through the hole before freezing over again. They unloaded the sled quickly. 1 tent went up on higher ground, ropes buried deep into snow for anchor. The fire pit was built from flat stones carried last trip, laid close to the ice edge. As they cut a second hole, a deep sound came from below, the slow break of ice shifting in the current. The dogs started to pull at their tethers, noses low. The men worked faster, spreading their weight wide, securing each hole with wooden planks. The snow thickened, visibility dropping a few meters every minute. They kept fishing anyway, knowing the return trip would already be slower. The snow grew heavier before the first fish came through the hole. A flash of silver, stiff in the freezing air. One man gripped it by the tail, hit it once against the ice, then laid it beside the sled. They worked in rhythm. Hook, pull, clean, hang. The bodies stacked neatly on a wire line stretched between 2 sled handles. Steam rose each time warm blood touched the air. The wind rose fast from the north. Snow hit from the side, finding every open seam in their clothes. They pulled the tents lower, pegged corners with ice picks, and turned sleds to form a barrier. The fire burned low, fed with short sticks and dry scraps from earlier trips. One man cut fish into strips near the flame, knife strokes short and controlled. Another melted snow in a small pot for water. Visibility dropped to nothing. The river edge was gone, replaced by white and motion. They worked slower now, hands stiff, tools sticking to skin. Each catch took longer. By the time the sled line was half full, their faces were coated with ice. The storm had reached full strength, and the sound of it swallowed everything except breath. They tied the last fish, secured the lines, and crouched by the fire, waiting for the worst of it to pass. The wind hit full force before dusk. The tents folded inward under pressure, canvas slapping against poles. The fire went out in seconds, smothered by driven snow. They anchored the sleds in a triangle, tied lines from each corner to keep the load from rolling. One man held the tent frame upright, while another shoveled snow against the base for weight. Every movement was slow, gloves frozen stiff, eyes half closed from ice buildup. The air burned skin. Exposed metal stuck to fingers. The dogs lay low, backs to the wind, silent under a thin layer of drift. They tried to restart the fire under a metal plate shield, but the match flame wouldn't hold. One man used a strip of fish skin soaked in fat. It caught, small and weak, but enough to dry the twine and start another flame. For an hour they took turns feeding it, clearing snow, tightening ropes. The storm roared without shape, erasing distance. At one point, the rear sled shifted and nearly tipped, spilling half the frozen fish. They crawled into the open, pulled the catch back by hand, stacking it under the tent floor. Every fish mattered. By the time the wind began to drop, their outer layers had stiffened like bark. The tent walls glowed faintly from the small fire inside, just enough to see each other's hands moving. They didn't rest. They checked ropes again, then waited for silence to return. By night, the wind thinned to a steady push. The air cleared enough to see the curve of the river again, half buried in snow. They cleared the tent entrance, shook off ice, and set the small fire again. Using dry kindling from a sealed tin, the flame caught quick this time, steady and orange against the dark. 3 fish were chosen from the stack. Heavy, frozen solid, they thawed them near the fire, scraping off frost with knife backs. The meat turned soft along the edges first, then steamed as it hit the pan, the smell of cooked fish mixed with wood smoke and wet fabric. They ate sitting on their packs, gloves off, faces close to the heat. The sound of chewing and the hiss of melting snow were the only noises. Outside, the rest of the catch hung stiff on the sled line, already refreezing for the return. The tent steamed lightly inside, heat pressing against the frozen outer shell. When the food was gone, they poured snow into the pot, made water, checked their gear again, and laid out their outer layers to dry for an hour. The storm had moved east, but its trail still carried low wind and snow haze. They packed the cooking gear, tied down the sled ropes, and waited for first light. At first light, the air was clear again. The sky turned gray-blue over the frozen plain. They broke camp without hurry, folded the tents, tied the poles, checked the fish load one last time. Every strap was pulled twice. The sled runners had iced over during the night. They scraped them clean with the knife blades until smooth again. The dog stood ready, silent, breath hung in the still air. The snow was deep but firm enough for travel. They moved out the same way they had come, one man walking ahead, the others behind the sleds. The trail was nearly gone, filled by wind, but the direction was fixed in memory and habit. By mid-morning, the camp smoke appeared faint on the horizon. The sled lines sagged from weight, the fish frozen into solid bundles. Nothing spoke of the storm, except the crusted snow and the burned marks, where the fire had been. The plain looked the same as before, wide, bound without trace, and the men kept moving, slow and steady, until the tents came into view again. Another trip done. Another storm passed. The work would begin again tomorrow.